Hey folks, and welcome to the channel. You may have already seen some of my Skeptical Linguist Bible studies. I just got my computer fixed, so the next one is coming soon. But I decided to start another series about bad arguments people make and how to combat them. And that's where we are today. So today, we're going to take down a guy who's been really annoying to logical, rational thinkers in the skeptic and religious communities alike. The great controversy-baiting, self-proclaimed educator Steve McRae. Specifically here responding to the video, What is an Atheist? Over on Trinity Radio's page. The link is in the description.
Today, we're going to be having on a very well-known in the online worldview discussion arena, very well-known guy named Steve McRae, who is one of my agnostic friends.
So Steve McRae has gained most of his, at least his initial notoriety on drama surrounding harassment accusations, but I don't really care. I'm not here to ad hominem anybody. His big accomplishment is being able to annoy famous atheist actual educator Matt Dillahunty so much that he's been effectively blocked by a large portion of the atheist community. His whole shtick seems to be debating the definition of the word atheism and agnosticism, playing just kind of little word games that nobody but him cares about. Still, these arguments give people who don't know any better the impression that this guy is a serious scholar, because he knows words that scholars know, and his arguments sound too sophisticated and smart to argue against for people that aren't specialized in the kind of propositional logic that he gets up to. Fortunately, I'm a linguist, and I've studied this stuff, so.
Are we cowardly atheists? Are we just cowardly atheists? Is that
maybe that's it. Maybe the agnostic
The
is
late great-
atheism light.
Yeah, the late great Christopher Hitchens thought so for sure about agnostics.
Christopher Hitchens was wrong then. So for agnostic, the prefix a means without. Gnost, nost, means knowledge, and the suffix ic is just a descriptor. So this deals in what's called the epistemic realm, which means the realm that deals with what you know, or what you are certain of, or what you are convinced of. Now, that's different realm-wise from atheism. Atheism, you get the a again, without, or not. The refers to God, and the suffix ism refers to a belief. So this deals in what's called the doxastic realm, which is the realm that deals with what you believe. What you believe and what you know, two separate issues. Okay? These are the two realms of discussion to be had here. Unfortunately, Steve McRae only focuses on one of them, the doxastic realm. And this is why his entire mission fails spectacularly. But we'll get there.
Originally, there was this term called atheos, and there was a Greek term, and it meant basically somebody who denied worship of the state-sanctioned pantheonic gods, the Roman gods. And it referred to Christians, right? It was referring to Christians that worship this monotheistic God. And so they were without favor of the gods. They weren't without belief. They were without favor of the gods because these Roman gods denied them their request, and they basically denied them favor because they were no longer being worshipped. And so the term atheos has had many meanings over the years.
Okay, let's talk about that. The common usage of words does shift over time. That is very true. So one of the first things you learn when studying morphology in linguistics is that words are made of morphemes. These are the little building blocks of words. I already talked about some, agnostic. And that sometimes they can give rise to some ambiguity. Take unlockable, for instance. In the word unlockable, what does that mean? You have a prefix un. We all know what that means. We have the base morpheme lock, and we have the suffix able. So yeah, what does this word mean? Does it mean unlock plus able? In other words, does it mean able to be unlocked? Or does it mean un plus lockable, unable to be locked, mean totally different things because the construction of the word is ambiguous. Morphologically speaking, it could mean either thing. It just depends on what the person saying the word means by the word when they say it. And this is the same kind of ambiguity that we get with atheism. Does it mean A plus theism, so without God belief? Or does it mean athe plus ism, without God belief? In other words, does it mean that you believe in a lack of a God, or does it mean that you lack a belief in a God? Two different things. And it could mean either. It just depends on what the person saying the word means by it. Historical context aside, if words shift meaning over time, and the word is morphologically ambiguous, it stands to reason that we should accept one of the ambiguous ways of interpreting a word. So, while we're at it, theism, on the other hand, is not ambiguous. Theism is the belief in God, period. Note, belief in God. That's what theism is. That's all it is. If you're a theist, you believe in God. This is vastly important. It's not ambiguous like atheism. It can only mean one thing.
And Steve's paper is linked in the description. His article seeks to show that if one, and I'll let you'll say this better than me, but if one were to hold to what could be called the weak atheist position, that is, rather than saying, I believe that God does not exist, but instead said, I just don't believe in God. I lack a belief, as it's sometimes put.
Yes, that is how I put it.
That leads to what could be called a semantic collapse, where at least three terms in this discussion seem to lose the potency in their meaning. So, Steve, am I setting this up well? You take it from here for a moment.
Yeah, no, that's actually pretty much it. That's it. Thanks for joining.
So there you have it, the thesis. Or said another way,
in 1972, a man named Anthony Flew wrote a paper called The Presumption of Atheism that tried to argue that it would be better for atheists to use atheism or think of atheism as in the negative case, as in merely the non-belief of God's existence. And my paper basically shows if you take Flew's argument to its final conclusion, you basically now have three terms that have lost such axiological value that they're not just ambiguous, but they mean the same thing, that a person could semantically be a theist and atheist and agnostic at the same time. And if that's the case, why would we want to bother to have nuances of these positions? Why would you want two positions to be exactly the same?
Pay attention to that clip in particular.
Why would you want two positions to be exactly the same?
Matter of fact, let's listen to it again.
Why would you want two positions to be exactly the same?
So he's saying that the position that I have, which is that I don't know and I don't believe, that's fundamentally incoherent to him. He thinks I am incoherent for saying that. And it leads to what he calls semantic collapse. Well, too bad I didn't study higher order logic and semiotics, and oh wait, I did.
But as far as the argument, this has been vetted multiple times by logicians and mathematicians, and as far as the validity of the argument, it's sound.
Oh, the argument is sound, is it? It really isn't. And it's been vetted. Has it? Not really. If I can take this paper down as easily as I'm about to, trust me, there's much smarter people than me who would be able to take it down in a heartbeat. Maybe the problem is he's published this little paper of his on a site where nobody knows what they're talking about and nobody bothers to read the stuff. This isn't the point. Again, I'm not trying to just ad hominem the guy, but it's pretty goofy that he claims his paper stands undefeated by rigorous peer review or something. It's literally a bad paper on a site where anybody can publish anything. And nobody's looking at it because it's Steve McRae. Again, links in the description. Okay, let's get to the argument.
Why don't you start walking us through this as it relates to the atheist side?
Yeah, you set it up with the square of opposition.
Really easy. Okay, so the way I approach this is twofold. One, Dr. Oppie, Graham Oppie, who I think is probably the most brilliant atheist contemporary philosopher over time. Great guy. He's been on my show. The man is just beyond genius. He noted this. He noted this in one of his books that if you allow for weak atheism, you should have to allow for weak theism. When you allow for the, I just want atheism to be a lack of belief, you have to allow theists to make that same move.
This is where the sleight of hand starts. Pay attention. He's technically right so far, but...
Yeah, nobody takes that position of a weak theist position that I'm aware of. Well, I just lack a belief in the non-existence of God, right? Into that claim. But I mean, what would that debate be like? It'd just be a lack atheist and a lack theist.
I don't believe you. I don't believe you. Yeah, it's boring.
Yeah, they'd just be staring at each other for 2.5 hours. I don't have a positive claim. I don't have a positive claim either, and nothing happens. So.
Right. Nobody says that because why would they? Weak theists are theists. They believe in God. They might not be 100% sure, but they'd say that's where faith comes in. That is their position, that they believe. That's what they're going to put out there. So they'd say, well, I know I can't know for sure, but through faith I do believe. Because they're theists.
Well, it is funny because theists don't make that particular claim. One, because it would be kind of contradictory to the essence of what Christianity actually is, right? But the argument isn't that somebody's making it. The argument is that they could. You have to allow it if they did. Again, these are hypotheticals.
Okay. Yeah. They could say that. But, as I will demonstrate very soon, it'd be meaningless and vacuous and trivial to say it. He's about to get into his square of opposition, so I'll explain why in just a minute.
I like the idea of using what's called a semiotic square of opposition, where it's not categorical. You're not talking about all S or Ps. What you're talking about is a relationship between contraries. And contraries would be two things that could be false at the same time, but not true at the same time. And so I was like, hey, I like the way Burgess Jackson related agnosticism and theism to the square of opposition. And so what I did was I took that and I ran with it to show how to prove that if you do use these terms the way that these atheist organizations want people to use them, then you could logically have a person that's semantically called a theist, an atheist, and an agnostic, which seems to me an axiological depreciation of the verb.
The way he defines the terms and the positions he describes are fundamentally incorrect. So of course he's going to make something incorrect look stupid. That's easy. That's called a strawman. And that's not the fault of the agnostic atheists. That's his fault for strawmanning the positions.
And so I start off with the square of opposition here, which he's showing. And the way this works is very simple. These are relationships between terms. So the way you would read this is very simple. B is a verb, is an intentional verb called belief. S is a subject, and G is the proposition God exists. So basically, just read that as S believes G, or S believes God exists. It's simple. It's not that difficult to learn the logic. I think everybody agrees that is theism. I mean, if you don't agree with that, then I don't know where you want to go with it, right?
Agreed. S believes G is theism. Never forget that. That applies to weak or agnostic theists as well.
These relationships show what's called a contradiction. In other words, you start with the negation of that. So if you have BSG, the negation is not BSG.
Agreed.
It shows the contrary, which would be atheism.
Agreed. Well, kind of. What the contrary is strong atheism, which I'm also going to refer to as Gnostic atheism, because Gnostic is the opposite of agnostic, right? So instead of strong versus agnostic, let's call it that. People who believe that they know, or people who are certain, or people who are convinced that there is a God, or that they know there is no God. Those are Gnostics, or strong. That's the opposite of agnosticism. So let's keep with the naming conventions here so that it makes a little more sense. The contrary to Gnostic theism is Gnostic atheism. Close enough. Important distinction, but close enough. Go ahead.
And it shows the subcontraries, which is the agnostic position. And then subalternations, which just means that by implication, if you believe there's a God, you don't believe there is not a God. So if you read this, S believes G, it actually implies that S does not believe that there is no God, right? Because if you're a theist, you don't believe there is no God. You believe there is a God. So these are all relationships. That's all the square of opposition does here.
Because of the way agnosticism works, the subalternations don't work in reverse.
No, that'd be a contrary error.
Yes. You would have a big problem if the bottom and the top imply to each other. That would completely ruin the square of opposition, and everything in your square of opposition would be incoherent. Or rather, you could use the square of opposition to show that the positions are incoherent, one of the two. So here's what a real square of opposition looks like. Notice, if you will, that this is something that goes from universals to particulars. All philosophers are human means that also some philosophers are human. However, some philosophers are human does not mean that all philosophers are human. Get it? Steve McRae's semiotic square is about belief, though, so it operates a little bit differently. Here's the problem with what he's doing. Take a look at the left side here. Not BS, not G, or in other words, S does not believe, not G, is the opposite of BS, not G, right? You got BS, not G, versus not BS, not G. Right? We good on that? If Gnostic atheists say, I believe there is no God, then if you don't agree with Gnostic atheists, that automatically means your position includes not BS, not G. So this goes for everybody. This includes strong theism, weak theism, and weak atheism. All you're saying necessarily when you say not BS, not G, is I am not a strong atheist. Now you might be wondering, well, does this work for the other positions? And the answer is no, it does not. Do you remember what a theist is? A theist is someone who believes in God, or BSG. So, if you're a weak or agnostic theist, you believe in God. So, what do we have here? A problem. We see for strong or Gnostic atheism, BSG, belief in God, and not belief in not God. Well, we see the exact same set of things for weak or agnostic atheism. BSG, belief in God, and not belief in not God. Now remember what dude said?
Why would you want two positions to be exactly the same?
These subalternations don't work in reverse.
No, that'd be a contrary error.
This is not the relation he says it is. It's not a subalternation. It's the exact same statement. Now, we need a new term for whatever this is, and I'll call it redundancy. The bottom not only implies the top is the top. And the top implies the bottom and is the bottom. One more time now.
Why would you want two positions to be exactly the same?
These subalternations don't work in reverse.
No, that'd be a contrary error.
Now that's absurd. But it doesn't work that way with atheism. Again, atheism can take a yes or no position to declaring that God does not exist. It's either strong or Gnostic. In other words, I assert that God doesn't exist at all, or it's weak/agnostic. I'm not convinced, so I don't believe. Being convinced is a big part of the equation here, which he leaves off. It's not just about what you believe, it's about what you're convinced of. What you believe that you know. Steve is operating purely in the doxastic realm about beliefs, and this is how he caricatures the position to make it look incoherent when it isn't. Let's draw this up better, shall we? Here's strong atheism, and this is a better way to show the problem with the way Steve is setting it up, so forgive me rehashing this. Here we go. I believe that it is not the case that God exists, or I believe that there is no God, in other words. Now remember that all positions other than strong atheism hold a denial of strong atheism. That's the whole not believing, not God thing. So, here's theism. I believe that God exists, which means I deny strong atheism. I say no to I believe that it is the case that God does not exist, as discussed previously. Okay? As you see, these are mutually exclusive, just like Steve had. Now, let's go ahead and add agnostic atheism. I don't accept the assertion that God does not exist. It might be true, and it might not be true. Because I am not convinced, I do not believe. We see, just like in Steve's Steele, the subalternation works. Strong atheism means both things at once. It means I believe in a lack of God, and by extension, it also means I lack belief that God exists. It does not work the same way in reverse. Now, what's it called when it does work the same way in reverse? Steve? Help me out here, buddy.
That'd be a contrary error.
Thanks, Steve. We see here that there's a problem because it is not diametrically opposed to strong theism, and it's supposed to be. So what's going on here? Well, when you say, I don't believe in there is no God, it means something different to an atheist than it does to a theist. That's because theists, by definition, once again, say it with me, believe in God. If you believe in God and you don't believe in not God, there's only one thing you could mean by that. That you do believe in God. You're just saying it in a double negative. The car is not blue. The car is blue, in other words, right? So think about it this way. I believe your claim that you have a flying car, and I don't not believe your claim that you have a flying car. That's weird. It's the same statement, just in a double negative for no reason. You could also say, I don't not believe that you have a flying car, and so on and so forth. Just add multiples of 2 of the word not, and it's a little bit silly. On the other hand, you could say, I don't believe your claim that you have a flying car, but I don't disbelieve you either. I'm not convinced. These are totally different meanings. And so we have an ambiguous logical statement, in other words. Because it can mean 2 different things depending on what else it's connected to in the set of positions, which he has very cleverly subtracted from. So, we want a semiotic square of opposition in which the corners are diametrically opposed. So there's something wrong here. We will fix it in a minute, but let's continue. Here's that weird squishy agnostic theism thing. It is false that I believe what strong atheists say. However, I'm a theist, so I believe in God. Again, the top and the bottom are identical. This is a redundancy, not a subalternation. It works in reverse. Steve?
The subalternations don't work in reverse.
No, that'd be a contrary error.
It's still diametrically opposed to strong atheism, at least. That part still works. Here, you can't get the blue part, not believe God, from the right side. And you can't get the red part, believe God, from the left side. And both sides share a denial of strong atheism because they're not strong atheists. So, kind of superfluous to say. Now, it's clear that what Steve has set up here is absolutely nonsensical. His square of opposition doesn't have a subalternation where it needs one. And it doesn't have a contradiction where it needs one. That's because he's not describing the actual positions, which don't differ purely on beliefs, the doxastic. They actually differ on what you're convinced of. Now, here's how we should really set up a semiotic square of opposition if we want to talk about strong atheism versus weak atheism versus strong theism versus weak theism. Okay? Now, we start the same way, but we add a new argument into this. C, for convinced of. This would read, I am convinced that God does not exist, and so obviously that means I also believe that God does not exist. By the way, the little caret thingy means and in formal logic. Here we add theism. I am certain that God exists, and so obviously that means I believe that God exists. This contradicts nicely. Now, notice I'm not adding on the whole not B, not P. Like I said, it's ambiguous, and all it really means is I'm not a strong atheist. I mean, the very fact that we're comparing these positions means that we know that the others aren't strong atheists. Of course you deny that thing. Otherwise you would be a strong atheist, right? So we don't need it. Let's add agnostic atheism next. So we see that this works well. You've got a denial of the certainty. Now, this is redundant, but I'm just putting it in to show how this is supposed to relate in a real square of opposition. Ideally, you would just have this. But I'm including it to show how it plays with the other positions in a way that makes everything make sense. So, this contradicts. It's a denial of strong atheism, but the other two, these are entailed, and it's a perfect subalternation. Again, this is what it really looks like, and I'm just including this as a kind of a ghost, just to demonstrate. Now, we see the corners here are diametrically opposed, and that's what we want. Top right is certain that God exists. Bottom left is not certain that God exists. Top right believes that God exists. Bottom left does not believe that God exists. Diametrically opposed contradiction. Perfect. Just what we want. And here's the agnostic theist position. They are not C for convinced of the proposition, and they are not C for convinced that the proposition is false. And they believe P because they're theists. Again, we have that ghost contradiction just to show that agnostic theism is different from strong or Gnostic theism. Normally, we wouldn't put this in here. And just like on the other side, certainty that God exists, CP, entails that you are not certain that God does not exist. Meanwhile, belief that God exists, BP, is also just part of being a theist. So, agnostic theism says, I'm not certain that God exists, and I'm not certain that God doesn't exist, but I believe God exists. You see here, this is also diametrically opposed to the opposite corner, where the top left is certain about not P, the bottom right is not certain about not P. Where the top left believes that God does not exist, the bottom right believes that God does exist. Everything's working the way it's supposed to. Take notes, Steve. Yikes. Here we have our agreements. Both are not certain that God exists, and both are not certain that God does not exist. But they disagree on this statement. One says, I do not believe in the proposition. And the other one says, I do believe in the proposition. This is exactly how these kind of squares are supposed to operate. Back to the one we looked at earlier. You see here? You got the same redundant contradiction. It doesn't mean there isn't a genuine subalternation. Cool. See, if all cars are blue, that implies that some cars are blue. Lesser than all cars are blue works perfectly fine with some cars are blue, but it doesn't work with all cars are blue. And it's the same pattern on the right-hand side. I'll let you look at it for a second to make sure that it makes sense. Does it make sense? Cool. The problem with Steve McRae's setup is ultimately, that agnosticism is about epistemology, not doxastics. It's about what we know, or at least what we're convinced of. And this is a separate issue, again, from what you believe. Because you can believe without being convinced. Agnostic atheists say they're not convinced that a God exists, and because of this, they lack a positive belief. Agnostic theists say that they are not convinced that God exists, but in spite of that, they have a positive belief. Steve ignores the whole question of whether they're convinced and leaves it all about belief. And when he constructs it this way, he's using a double negative to mask what's actually a positive statement. Tricky, tricky. It's actually very, very transparent. This leads to a semiotic square that doesn't work and mischaracterizes what agnostic atheism and agnostic theism are. Only by telling half of the story can he make his case. So that's what he's done. And in so doing, what's he done? Tell us one more time, Steve.
These subalternations don't work in reverse.
No, that'd be a contrary error.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Peer review, my ass.